Between 1940 and 1944, over 6,000 French women were executed by the Nazis for acts of resistance. Yet their names rarely appear in history books. Among them were couriers who pedaled through occupied France on bicycles, dismissed as harmless girls by German soldiers until supply lines erupted in flames, trains derailed into darkness, and the Wehrmacht began to realize they'd been deceived by the most overlooked. Warriors of the war. This is their story. The morning of June 14, 1940, began with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the suffocating quiet that falls over a city moments before a catastrophe. Paris, the city of light, stood frozen under an ash-gray sky as columns of German soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées. Their boots struck the cobblestones in perfect rhythm, a drumbeat of conquest echoing through empty boulevards. Windows shuttered, doors locked. Mothers pulled their children inside and whispered prayers they barely believed anymore. France had fallen. Within weeks, the swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. German commandants moved into grand hotels. Signs in Gothic script appeared on cafe windows. Nur für Wehrmacht. Only for the Wehrmacht. The occupation was complete, methodical, absolute. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a dismantling of identity, a rewriting of existence. Every street corner now had a German sentry. Every train platform, a checkpoint. Every letter opened, every telephone line tapped. Every neighbor potentially an informant. In the villages of rural France, the quiet corners far from Paris, life became a performance. Farmers bowed their heads as convoys rumbled past their fields. Shopkeepers smiled tightly when officers entered. Women averted their eyes when soldiers whistled or called out crude remarks. Survival meant invisibility. Safety meant silence. But beneath that silence, something else was stirring. In kitchens and farmhouses, in churches and attics, conversations began in whispers. Old hunting rifles were hidden in haystacks. Maps were sketched by candlelight. And in the shadows of occupation, a question repeated itself, passed from lip to ear like a prayer. What can we do? For many, the answer seemed hopeless. The French army had been crushed. The government had capitulated. Marshal Pétain, the aging hero of World War I, now preached collaboration from Vichy, urging the people to accept their fate with dignity. Resistance, he warned, would only bring suffering. But not everyone listened. In the Loire Valley, a schoolteacher named Genevieve began carrying messages between neighboring villages. In Brittany, a young seamstress named Marcel volunteered to hide British pilots shot down over the countryside. In Lyon, a nurse named Lucy used her hospital rounds to smuggle documents past German patrols. These women didn't call themselves heroes. They didn't even call themselves resistors, not yet. They were simply people who refused to stop living, who refused to accept that the enemy had won everything. And they discovered something the Nazis had overlooked. A weapon hiding in plain sight. The bicycle. France had always been a nation of cyclists. Before the war, bicycles were everywhere. Farmers rode them to market. Children rode them to school. Women rode them to visit neighbors or pick up bread. They were as common as the air itself. And when the Germans confiscated cars, banned public transport for French civilians, and rationed fuel to a trickle, bicycles became the only means of movement left. The occupiers saw this as control. They saw French citizens reduced to slow, visible, harmless travel on two wheels. What they didn't see, what their arrogance blinded them to, was that those bicycles could move faster than marching soldiers, slip through back roads no convoy could follow, and carry cargo the Germans would never think to search. By the autumn of 1940, the first coded messages were traveling across France in wicker baskets, wrapped in bread, hidden in bundles of laundry, tucked beneath flowers. Young women pedaled through checkpoints, their faces calm, their hearts pounding. Their handlebars weighted with secrets that could topple regimes. The resistance was born on two wheels, and the Nazis, standing at their roadblocks with rifles and dogs, waved them through with laughter. Her name was Simone. She was 19 years old, with sun-streaked hair braided down her back and a laugh that once filled village festivals. Now, in the spring of 1941, she pedaled her bicycle along a dirt road just outside Orleans. Her breath steady despite the weight pressing down on her chest, not the weight of fear, though that was there too, but the literal weight. Beneath her cotton blouse, wrapped tightly against her ribs with strips of cloth, were 3 pounds of plastic explosives. The checkpoint loomed ahead. 2 German soldiers stood beside a wooden barrier, smoking cigarettes and watching the road with bored indifference. One of them glanced up as Simone approached, his eyes flicking over her with the casual dismissiveness men reserve for things they don't consider threats. She slowed, smiled, let her bicycle wobble slightly, as if she were nervous, which she was, but not for the reasons they'd assume. "Papier," the older soldier said lazily. Holding out his hand, Simone handed over her papers. They were forged, of course, but beautifully done crisp stamps, perfect signatures, the kind of quality that came from networks far more sophisticated than the Germans suspected. The soldier barely glanced at them. His gaze drifted instead to the basket attached to her handlebars, where a loaf of bread and bouquet of wildflowers sat innocently in the afternoon sun. "Where are you going?" he asked in broken French. "To my aunt's house," Simone replied, her voice soft and sweet. "She's been ill. I'm bringing her bread." The soldier grunted. His companion chuckled, said something in German she didn't understand. They both laughed. The older one waved her through. *alle. Simone pedaled on, her legs trembling now, but not from exertion. It wasn't until she reached the next village 2 miles down, past the old stone church, that she allowed herself to exhale fully. There, in the back room of a butcher shop, she unwrapped the explosives from her body and handed them to a man she knew only as Jacques. He didn't thank her, didn't smile, just nodded once, took the package, and disappeared into the shadows. She was back on her bicycle 10 minutes later, pedaling home before curfew, her basket now carrying only bread and flowers. This was her life now. This was the life of thousands like her. The resistance. Francaise had learned quickly. The best couriers were the ones no one suspected. And in Nazi-occupied France, no one suspected young women on bicycles. By 1941, the network was vast. It stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Swiss border, from Normandy to the Pyrenees. At its heart were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, shopkeepers, mothers, but the arteries that kept it alive were the couriers. They carried intelligence from spies embedded in German headquarters. They transported sabotage materials to cells preparing ambushes. They guided Allied airmen shot down over France toward escape routes into Spain. And they did it all on bicycles. The reasons were strategic. Bicycles required no fuel, left no paper trail, made no noise. They could navigate forest paths and farm tracks where cars couldn't follow. They were fast enough to outrun patrols on foot, but slow enough to avoid suspicion. And most importantly, they were ridden by young women, often who the German soldiers viewed as decorative, harmless, beneath notice. This wasn't an accident. The resistance exploited German misogyny with ruthless precision. One courier, a woman named André, became legendary for her audacity. She once pedaled past a Wehrmacht convoy with a British pilot disguised as her brother, his RAF uniform hidden beneath a farmer's coat. When a German officer stopped them and asked where they were going, André smiled brilliantly and said, "To our cousin's wedding in the next village. You're welcome to join us for wine afterward." The officer laughed, waved them on, and never knew he'd just let an enemy combatant slip through his fingers. Another courier, known only as La Popette, the little doll specialized in transporting weapons. She was barely 16, with wide blue eyes and a face so innocent that soldiers often joked with her at checkpoints. What they didn't know was that her bicycle frame had been hollowed out, packed with disassembled pistols and ammunition. She made over 40 runs before the Gestapo finally caught her. Even then, she didn't break. She died in Ravensbrück, her silence intact. The couriers operated in cells, isolated from one another for security. Most knew only a handful of contacts, code names, meeting spots, drop-off locations. If one was captured, the damage stayed contained. This fragmentation saved countless lives, but it also meant that many couriers never knew the full scope of what they were part of. They peddled their routes, delivered their packages, and returned home to cook dinner or mend clothes, never realizing they were cogs in a machine dismantling the Third Reich from within. But the Nazis were beginning to notice the cracks dot by the winter of 1942. German intelligence reports started mentioning unusual bicycle traffic in certain regions. Supply depots were being hit with suspiciously accurate timing. Resistance ambush seemed coordinated across impossible distances. And always in the aftermath, witnesses reported seeing young women on bicycles near the sites, sometimes hours before, sometimes minutes after. The Wehrmacht issued new orders, increased checkpoint inspections, search baskets more thoroughly, detained suspicious cyclists for questioning. The couriers adapted. They changed routes daily, used decoys, traveled in pairs, one carrying the real cargo, the other acting as bait. They learned to read German soldiers' moods, to flirt just enough to distract, but not enough to provoke. They became actresses, performing innocence so convincingly that even paranoid Gestapo agents waved them through. And still, they pedaled on. The laughter came first. It always did. On a warm afternoon in August 1942, near the town of Chartres, a German patrol watched a young woman cycle past their position. Her dress fluttered in the breeze. Her hair was tied back with a ribbon. She looked like a painting, some pastoral fantasy of French countryside life. One of the soldiers whistled. Another called out, "Mademoiselle, are you lost?" She turned, smiled shyly, and shook her head. "Non, merci." The soldiers laughed as she disappeared around a bend. One of them muttered something crude. The others grinned. To them, she was just another pretty distraction in a boring occupation. A girl on a bicycle, probably headed to market or a lover's house. Harmless, irrelevant. 6 hours later, the rail line outside Chartres erupted in flames. The explosion tore through a supply train carrying ammunition and fuel, destined for Rommel's Afrika Korps. The blast shattered windows 3 miles away. Secondary explosions rippled through the night as rail cars ignited one after another, turning the tracks into a river of fire. It took the Germans 2 weeks to clear the wreckage and another month to restore the line. By then, the couriers had already moved on to the next target. This was the pattern. The Nazis saw girls on bicycles and dismissed them. The resistance saw weapons of war and deployed them with surgical precision. The German military, for all its technological superiority and tactical brilliance, suffered from a fatal blindness. They could not imagine women as combatants. Women were wives, mothers, lovers, objects of desire or domesticity, but never danger. This wasn't just prejudice. It was doctrine. The Nazi ideology itself enshrined rigid gender roles. Women belonged in the home, bearing children for the fatherland. The idea that they could fight, sabotage, kill it didn't compute. And so, even as evidence mounted, the Germans struggled to adjust. Field reports described bicycles at sabotage sites. Interrogations revealed women involved in resistance cells. Intelligence officers warned that French females were being used as couriers. But the Wehrmacht's response remained sluggish, disbelieving. How much damage, after all, could a girl on a bicycle really do? The answer: more than they could calculate. By 1943, the cycling couriers had become the nervous system of French resistance. They didn't just carry messages. They were the infrastructure that allowed separate cells to coordinate. That turned isolated acts of sabotage into campaigns. That transformed scattered rebels into an army. In Brittany, a network of couriers connected coastal watchers with London, relaying real-time intelligence on German naval movements. In the Rhine Valley, they transported forged documents that saved hundreds of Jews from deportation. In Normandy, they mapped German defenses for the Allied invasion that everyone knew was coming, and they were almost invisible. André de Jong, a Belgian nurse who created the Comet Line, an escape route for Allied airmen, once cycled over 800 miles in a single month, guiding pilots through occupied France and into Spain. She crossed the Pyrenees on foot 24 times, evading patrols, blizzards, and betrayal. When she was finally captured in 1943, the Gestapo refused to believe she was the network's leader. They assumed a man must be in charge. They tortured her for weeks, demanding the name of her commander. She never gave them one, because there wasn't one. She was or consider Lucy Albrecht, who orchestrated her husband's escape from Gestapo custody, not once, but twice, using nothing but a bicycle, forged papers, and breathtaking audacity. She posed as his pregnant fiancée, then as a lawyer, then as a German officer's mistress, improvising roles like an actress in a deadly play. Each time, she pedaled away from danger with her heart pounding and her face serene. These women weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They had no uniforms, no ranks, no medals. But they were warriors, and their battlefield was every road, every checkpoint. Every moment they chose defiance over submission, and the Nazis, blinded by their own arrogance, kept waving them through. But that arrogance was beginning to crack by the spring of 1943. The German occupation had entered a darker phase. The initial months of relative restraint were over. The Gestapo tightened its grip. Curfews shortened. Reprisals grew harsher. For every German soldier killed, 10 French hostages were shot. For every sabotaged rail line, entire villages were burned. The resistance responded by going deeper underground. And the couriers, once merely messengers, became combat operatives. It started small. A woman named Odette, cycling through the Dordogne region, began carrying not just messages, but detonators, small mechanical timers used to trigger explosives remotely. She'd deliver them to sabotage teams preparing to destroy bridges or fuel depots, then pedal away before the blast, her presence unrecorded. Her role unknown. Another courier, Marguerite, specialized in reconnaissance. She'd cycle past German installations, airfields, bunkers, supply dumps, memorizing details with photographic precision. Guard rotations, fence weaknesses, vehicle counts. She'd return to her handler and recite everything from memory, never writing anything down, leaving no evidence if captured. And then there was Claire. Claire's story is less documented than the others, preserved mostly through whispered accounts and fragmented records. But those who knew her said she was fearless to the point of madness. She carried explosives regularly, not hidden, but openly disguised as farm supplies or engine parts. Once, when stopped at a checkpoint and asked what she was transporting, she told the truth: dynamite. The soldiers laughed, thinking it was a joke, and let her pass. She wasn't joking. By late 1943, the network had expanded beyond individual cells into coordinated operations. The Allies, preparing for D-Day, needed chaos behind German lines. They needed bridges destroyed, railways severed, communications disrupted. They needed the Wehrmacht stretched thin, confused, Unable to respond effectively to the coming invasion, the couriers would be crucial. In the months before D-Day, British intelligence worked closely with the French resistance through a program called Plan Vert, the Green Plan. The objective: cripple German logistics across northern France. Thousands of targets were identified: rail junctions, fuel depots, telephone exchanges, roads. The resistance would hit them all simultaneously, creating a wave of destruction the Germans couldn't contain. But coordinating such an operation required communication. Orders had to be transmitted. Teams had to be synchronized. Supplies had to be delivered. And all of it traveled on bicycles. In the weeks before the invasion, the couriers worked around the clock. They carried coded instructions from Allied commanders to resistance leaders scattered across the countryside. They transported explosives, weapons, maps. They guided Allied agents parachuted in under cover of darkness. Some made 3 or 4 runs in a single night, pedaling through blackout conditions, navigating by memory and starlight. Their bodies pushed to the edge of collapse. One courier, a woman named Yvonne, later described those weeks. "We didn't sleep. We didn't think. We just moved. My legs were numb. My hands bled from gripping the handlebars. But we couldn't stop. Every message we carried, every package we delivered, it could be the difference between someone living or dying. So we pedaled." Asterisk, the Nazis sensed something was coming. Checkpoint inspections intensified. Patrols increased. The Gestapo arrested hundreds on suspicion alone. Torture chambers filled with resistors who refused to talk. Execution squads worked overtime. But the network held. And then, on the night of June 5, 1944, the order came: execute Plan Vert. The first explosion tore through the Normandy rail line at 11:47 p.m. Just 30 minutes before Allied paratroopers began dropping over Saint-Mir-Église. The blast shattered a locomotive hauling reinforcements toward the coast, derailing 16 cars and blocking the track for days. The second explosion hit a fuel depot outside Cannes. Flames shot 200 feet into the air, visible for miles. German firefighters rushed to contain it, but secondary blasts kept erupting, each one feeding the inferno. Asterisk, the third explosion, a bridge over the Loire River, collapsed into the water in a thunderous roar, cutting off a critical supply route. And then the fourth, the fifth, the 10th. All across northern France, the night erupted. Bridges fell. Trains derailed. Communication lines went dead. Roads cratered. Fuel dumps burned. In a single coordinated strike, the resistance unleashed years of pent-up fury, and the German war machine convulsed, and pedaling through the chaos. Invisible in the darkness were the couriers. Some delivered final instructions to sabotage teams. Others guided Allied agents to their targets. A few carried explosives themselves, planting charges and cycling away before the blast. They moved through a landscape transformed into a battlefield, dodging patrols, navigating around destroyed infrastructure, their bicycles somehow still rolling despite the madness. One courier, a teenager named Solange, made 5 runs that night. She delivered detonators to a team preparing to destroy a railway tunnel, then cycled 15 miles to guide a British commando unit through German lines, then returned to pick up a wounded resistor and transport him to a safe house, then carried a message to another cell confirming their targets, then finally, as dawn broke, pedaled home and collapsed in her kitchen, still gripping her handlebars as she fell asleep. The impact was devastating. German divisions trying to reach Normandy found themselves stranded, unable to move. Reinforcements that should have arrived in hours took days or never arrived at all. Fuel shortages crippled panzer units. Communication breakdowns left commanders blind. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to rapid deployment and overwhelming force, found itself paralyzed by an enemy it hadn't taken seriously. The girls on bicycles had won, but victory came at a cost. Helene knew they were coming for her. She'd known for 3 days, ever since the Gestapo raided the safe house in Tours and found the coded logbook. Her name wasn't in it. She'd been careful, but they'd interrogate everyone, and someone would break. Someone always did. She could have run. Should have. But there was one more delivery to make: a set of forged papers for a Jewish family hiding in a farmhouse outside the city. Without those papers, they'd be discovered within days. Executed, or worse, sent east to the Camp Stade. So Helene cycled one last time. She made the delivery just after dawn, handed the papers to a woman with hollow eyes and trembling hands, whispered a blessing she didn't believe in, and turned to leave. The Gestapo was waiting at the end of the driveway. They beat her in the back of the truck, dragged her into a basement room that smelled of blood and fear. Asked her questions she refused to answer. Hit her again. And again, she never spoke. 3 weeks later, they put her on a train to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She died there in February 1945, 3 months before her liberation, her body wasted by typhus and starvation. She was 23 years old. Helene's story is not unique. Hundreds of couriers were captured in the final year of the war. Some were executed, immediately shot in town squares as warnings to others. Some were tortured for information, then killed when they refused to talk. Some were sent to camps where they died slowly, forgotten by everyone except the few who survived to remember. The Gestapo was brutal, but the couriers were resilient. Even under torture, most refused to betray their networks. They endured unspeakable pain to protect people they'd never met, to safeguard operations they'd never see completed. Their silence was their final act of resistance. Not all were captured. Many survived to see liberation. But survival didn't mean escape from trauma. One former courier, interviewed decades later, described the aftermath. I couldn't sleep for years. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that bicycle, waiting for the bullet. Every checkpoint, every German face, every moment thinking, this is it. This is where I die. And I couldn't talk about it. Who would understand? We weren't heroes. We were just there. The psychological toll was immense. These women had lived double lives, outwardly normal, inwardly at war. They'd carried death on their bodies, smiled at their enemies, buried their fear so deep it became part of them. And when the war ended, there was no decompression, no therapy, no recognition. They were expected to return to being daughters, wives, mothers, as if nothing had happened. Many couldn't. Some left France entirely, unable to live among the places that held so much pain. Others withdrew into silence, their stories locked away. A few spoke out, trying to ensure the world remembered. But their voices were often drowned out by narratives focused on soldiers, generals, battles, the real war. As if their war had been something less, but their war had been everything. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated. The streets that had been silent under occupation now roared with celebration. French flags hung from every window. Church bells rang for the first time in 4 years. And through the crowds, barely noticed amid the chaos, rolled the bicycles. Some of the couriers were there, anonymous in the celebration, their faces scarred by experiences they'd never fully share. They didn't march in parades, didn't give speeches, didn't seek recognition. They simply stood in the streets they'd once crossed in terror, watching as their country came back to life, knowing they'd helped make this moment possible. In the years that followed, France began the long process of remembering. Monuments were erected. Names were carved in stone. Historians documented the resistance, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. but the couriers remained largely invisible. Part of this was structural. Resistance networks had been deliberately fragmented for security, making it difficult to reconstruct who did what. Part was cultural. Women's contributions in war were often minimized or romanticized, reduced to supporting roles rather than recognized as combatants. And part was personal. Many couriers simply didn't want to talk about it. Yet slowly, over decades, their stories emerged. Andrée de Jong was eventually recognized, awarded medals by multiple countries, and lived to see her comet line celebrated in museums and books. Lucy Albrecht became a prominent voice for resistance memory, writing memoirs and advocating for recognition of women's roles. And gradually, through interviews, archives, and patient historical work, the scope of what the couriers accomplished became clear. They weren't just messengers. They were the infrastructure of resistance. They made sabotage possible. They saved lives. They gathered intelligence that shaped Allied strategy. And they did it all while being dismissed, mocked, underestimated by an enemy that couldn't imagine women as warriors. Today, if you visit certain villages in France, you'll find small plaques on old buildings. I say, Une femme de la résistance a vécu. Here, a woman of the resistance lived. The plaques don't always include names. Sometimes, the names were never recorded. But they're there, marking places where ordinary people did extraordinary things. And if you look closely at old photographs from the Liberation, grainy black and white images of crowds celebrating in the streets, you might spot them. Women with bicycles, standing at the edges, watching, remembering. Their wheels carried a nation's defiance. Their courage changed the course of war, and their legacy endures. Not in monuments or medals, but in the simple, undeniable fact that they refused to surrender. The Nazis mocked the French, girls on bicycles, but those girls burned their empire to the ground. Asterisk. These women pedaled through hell and emerged as legends. Do you know a story of unsung resistance from your own region or family history? Share it in the comments below. Let's make sure these voices are never forgotten. And if this story moved you, share it. The more we remember, the more we honor their sacrifice.